It was the summer of 2008 in Westport, Connecticut. Paul Newman, the living icon of the motion picture capital, lay in his sickbed, patiently enduring each wave of pain as it came and went. Every afternoon, he would request that a Panasonic tape recorder be placed right next to his pillow. It was not for recording memoirs nor for making a documentary film. It was for a confession no one could have anticipated. 6 secret gay love affairs he had shared with some of the most famous leading men in Hollywood. There was one who had held his hand in the middle of the night, swearing to love him until the end of time, only to quietly send a copy of his love letter to a tabloid reporter the next morning for blackmail. There was another who secretly recorded every private conversation they had, just to threaten that if he ever spoke out, all of Hollywood would see him as a delusional liar. So, who exactly were these names? And why did Paul keep this secret buried until the final days of his life? The first person Paul Newman mentioned in that tape recording, none other than Marlon Brando once. Marlon Brando, a love that slid deep into desire and pain. The first time they met was in 1961 at a fundraising gala held at the Beverly Hilton Hotel. Paul arrived with his wife Joanne Woodward, maintaining his usual air of elegance and composure. Brando came late, walking in wearing a wrinkled shirt, his eyes carrying a mix of playful mischief and an undertone of cold detachment, then stood behind Paul for the rest of the evening. When he finally spoke, Brando said, "I thought you'd be as boring as the papers made you out to be." Pausing briefly before adding, "Turns out you're the only one here who isn't pretending." And that night, for the first time, Paul, a man who usually kept his distance from flattering words, did not push back. From casual coffees in Westwood to late-night walks around Silver Lake, and even sudden secret flights to Palm Springs that no one else knew about, a bond slowly began to form between them, one that was difficult to name. Paul loved with all the seriousness and sincerity of someone who meant every feeling. Brando did not. For Brando, everything, including love, could be a role to play. He didn't love like other people, Paul said in a tape recording dated August 3, 2008. He would pull me out of my familiar world, drop me into rooms full of strangers, situations I didn't understand, and eyes I couldn't control. The meetings Brando brought Paul to often took place in secluded mansions in Laurel Canyon or in short-term rentals at Venice Beach, always in the company of directors, journalists, producers, and vague promises about new films, awards, and fame. At first, Paul thought these were simply social gatherings, but eventually he realized they were all behind-the-scenes scripts Brando had orchestrated scenarios in which every gaze was fixed on Marlon, while Paul was merely a supporting character kept around only so long as he was useful for Marlon's publicity pushes. What was worse was that Brando himself leaked information about Paul's handwritten letters, words soft, trusting, and vulnerable to photographer Mark Weller, a tabloid stringer who regularly contributed to the Los Angeles Mirror. In 1965, the paper suddenly ran an anonymous column titled "Love Behind the Lens," describing a famed actor, a Venice Award winner, torn between family life and a secret relationship with a dark-haired screen icon. Everyone quietly understood it was Paul. Paul himself had no idea that it was Marlon who had left that envelope at the newspaper front desk. Why? Because Brando needed a scandal. He needed his name mentioned. He needed the press to dig up old photographs and stir up past stories just to make sure the name Marlon Brando would never fade from the public's mind. And Paul, the man who had loved him, trusted him, and chosen silence, became the price for Brando's hollow need to remain relevant. What made it even more painful for Paul was the moment Joanne, his devoted wife, happened upon a copy of that letter in a bookshelf drawer. She said nothing. She simply left him a small note. "If you need a place to take shelter, I'm still here. But if you need one more lie, I'm not the person who can help you." Then came a long winter in Connecticut. Paul barely left the house for weeks. His daughter, Nell Newman, recalled that it was the period when her father would often wake in the middle of the night, quietly step out to the back porch, and smoke alone in the cold that numbed his hands. No one asked, but everyone knew. In one of his final recordings, Paul said, "I used to believe that if I was patient enough, if I loved him long enough, I could make him change." But Brando never changed. He only knew how to turn genuine feelings into tools for survival. And I let him turn me into that tool, even when I knew I didn't deserve it. Then his voice lowered like a sigh. I loved him. In a way, no one should ever love anyone. The story between Paul and Brando didn't end with a fight or a farewell. It ended in silence when Paul stopped answering the phone, stopped writing letters, and stopped believing that love could change a person. But the regret never ended. And not everyone who hurt Paul simply left. There was one man who entered his life not as a lover but as a storm of possession and power. a man who once openly defended him only to later use that very protection as a way to control everything. That man was Steve McQueen. To point Robert Redford, a love betrayed before millions. In 1969, all of Hollywood was swept up in the cowboy fever of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. The press hailed it as the most perfect pairing between two men ever seen on screen. Paul Newman played Butch, charming, intelligent, cunning. Robert Redford became Sundance cool, sharp, and tinged with danger. But few knew that in the final days of May, while the film was being shot at Zion National Park in Utah, another story completely off-script was quietly unfolding whenever the camera stopped rolling a secret love affair. At the time, Paul Newman was 44, living with his wife Joanne Woodward in Connecticut. Robert Redford was just 32, married to Lola Van Wagen and the father of 3 young children. Both were family men, yet between them emerged a subtle, unexplainable pull, something that made them seek each other out. During cast meals, quietly anticipate the next scene just for the chance to stand close brush shoulders or simply hold each other's gaze a few seconds longer than normal. According to Dennis Corbin, a lighting crew member, one weekend night, while the cast stayed at a lodge in Springdale, Utah, he saw Paul standing outside Redford's balcony at midnight, a cigarette in hand, eyes red. "I didn't ask," he recalled, "but I saw Robert open the door, pull him inside, and then they were gone." And of course, it would not be the last time. From 1970 through the early 1980s, the two men lived parallel lives, legendary co-stars, by day secret lovers by night. Only one believed the relationship was real. The other only sought to bury it. In a recording dated July 14, 2008, Paul said, "We both had wives, children, reputations, but I loved him with a kind of feeling that fit no pattern. I kept thinking that if I stayed silent long enough, if I waited with enough patience, there would come a day when he'd hold my hand in the daylight the way he held it in the dark." That day never came. In 1976, Paul planned to reveal the truth to Stephen Close, a New Yorker journalist who had done a long feature on him the previous year. At the Algonquin Hotel in Manhattan, just hours before their meeting, Paul received a call from Robert Redford's representative. "If you utter one word about it, you'll lose everything." That very evening, Claus received an anonymous fax accusing Paul Newman of being mentally unstable, abusing prescription alcohol, and having once shoved a female assistant while drunk. The interview was canceled. Paul's career began to stall for reasons no one could publicly explain. A few weeks later, a Palm Springs tabloid called the Daily Star ran a story claiming that a veteran star has been shunned by a former co-star due to signs of violence and emotional instability. No names were mentioned, but the implication was clear, and Robert, the same man Paul had once mentored and supported, remained completely silent. At the 1980 BAFTA Awards, in one of the rare moments when he was asked directly, a BBC reporter said, "Do you still keep in touch with Paul?" Robert answered calmly, "We made something great together, but everyone has to move on." Then he turned away, not waiting for another question. And Paul, he returned home, opened his journal, and added a line in a trembling hand. "The man who once called me his light now uses me as his shadow to shield his public image. He didn't just deny me, he broke the real part of me, the part I'd never dare bring into the light if it weren't for him." That love did not end with a breakup. It ended in a silence that had been carefully arranged, a silence that lasted until the coffin was closed. One might have thought Redford was the final limit of Paul's heartbreak, but he wasn't. The next name Paul spoke belonged to a young man who at just 24 years old had made America weep, a wild, burning spirit who died far too soon. Do you think you know who it is? 3. Steve McQueen. When love became a fire that burned them both. Steve McQueen, that bastard. Paul Newman let the words fall, each syllable carrying the weight of a lifetime's resentment. It was not the anger over a single remark or an isolated act. It was the rage born from years of being manipulated, suppressed, and consumed by a love that was both passionate and toxic to the point of suffocation. Their first meeting took place backstage at the Photoplay Awards in 1956. At the time, Paul was already a married man, while Steve was just a young up-and-comer, sharpening his reputation through small television roles. But the way Steve looked at Paul, defiant, unguarded, and laced with possession, made it impossible for him to turn away. It didn't take long for their fleeting encounters to turn into clandestine meetings that lasted for hours at the Chateau Marmont Hotel. Paul once said in a recorded tape, "I used to believe he loved me, but then I realized he just needed someone to prove that even Newman could be his to own." When Confidential magazine spread a rumor in 1962 claiming that Steve McQueen had an unusually close relationship with a male actor in New York, Steve reacted immediately. Within a week, he was seen hand-in-hand with Anne Margaret at the premiere of The War Lover. At the same time, Paul was handed a non-disclosure agreement to sign delivered personally by Steve's lawyer. You know what happens to people who get exposed, don't you? Steve whispered as he slid the paper forward. You've got a family. You've got a daughter. Don't let it all come crashing down just because you're too weak. He didn't just threaten. He erased every trace with money, with lawyers, with shadowy connections in the media. Once Paul stumbled across a payment of more than $15,000 from Steve to an editor at Variety to never again mention the name Newman in an investigative piece that was being prepared. But the cruelest blow had yet to come. In 1965, during an appearance on the M.V. Griffin Show, Steve smirked when asked about rumors that a man had once been obsessed with him. He replied, "I don't remember his name. Probably just some overzealous fan, the kind who sends love letters and knocks on my door in the middle of the night. Pretty creepy, really." Paul heard it and he understood. Steve didn't just wipe away the past. He burned it to ashes, then shoved those ashes into someone else's mouth. On another occasion when they crossed paths backstage during the filming of The Towering Inferno in 1973, Paul shouted, "Why did you turn me into a madman in the eyes of the whole world?" Steve only laughed, opened a drawer, and tossed out a cassette tape. "Just a precaution? If you ever say something you shouldn't, I'll have the evidence to answer every word." He had secretly recorded every private conversation, every argument, every confession of love, every moment of vulnerability. Steve kept it all like an arsenal ready to be used if Paul ever betrayed him. When Steve married Ally McGraw in 1973, Paul said nothing. But a few days later, a package arrived at Steve's house. Inside was the torn shirt Steve had worn after a drunken night at Paul's cabin in Vermont. The bloodstains, the scent of liquor, and the lipstick marks all still intact. It was no gift. It was the final warning. Paul's voice broke in one of his recordings. He used love like a knife. Every embrace was another cut. And yet, I still couldn't stop coming back. I still loved him, even though I knew he'd be the one to kill me if I let him one step closer. And then, as if fate refused to grant Paul even a moment's peace, the next man to enter his life was the complete opposite, Robert Redford. Gentle, warm, loving, like a melancholy song. And yet it too ended in betrayal. For James Dean, the companion in the fateful night in Mexico. For Paul Newman, James Dean was not the most scandalous love of his life, but he was the one that left him with the deepest wound. It was a love that began in admiration, grew into a profound connection, and ended in heartbreak, the kind of heartbreak one carries to the very end of life. They met in the spring of 1955 on the cold cement floor of the Warner Brothers lot. Paul, then 30, was playing the lead in Somebody Up There Likes Me. James, only 24 at the time, had just shot to fame following the success of East of Eden. By all accounts, they should have been rivals. But the first look James gave Paul carried no trace of competition. It was full of wonder. Then came a smile that kept Paul awake for 3 straight nights. They began seeing each other more often, sometimes in a quiet corner of an all-night diner along Ventura Boulevard, other times on aimless drives in James' brand-new Porsche 550. There were afternoons spent lying in a wooden cabin in OG, listening to Laboam pretending to be scene partners running lines. But in truth, every line they spoke was an unspoken confession of love. One rainy night after the premiere of Rebel Without a Cause, James told Paul, "I don't need anyone to understand me. I just need you not to pretend when you're with me." Paul didn't reply. He simply took the young man's hand and placed it over his chest where his heart was racing. But life never lets beautiful things be. That June, an unknown paparazzo named Eddie Prescott captured a photograph of the 2 men kissing through the window of a parked car near Sunset Strip. No paper dared print it outright, but just days later, the gossip column, Shadow Lovers of the Yarofty Silver Screen, in the Los Angeles Herald-Express sent shockwaves through Hollywood. No names were mentioned, but everyone knew. James was immediately dropped from his promotional contract with Warner Brothers, and Paul lost a role in a George Stevens project. Worse still was the reaction from within the industry. One production executive faxed Paul directly, "If you don't want to sink like Montgomery Cliff, you'd better teach your wife how to hold your hand in public." James fell apart. He began avoiding Paul. Calls went unanswered, letters unreturned. One night, Paul showed up at James' house and knocked for hours. No one came to the door, only a small note wedged in the frame written in a trembling hand. "I don't deserve to live, if living in your eyes is wrong." 3 days later, James was hospitalized after an overdose of sleeping pills. He survived, but the press showed no mercy. Some outlets like Daily Variety ran headlines such as, "Young actor suffers severe emotional disturbance." A columnist at the New York Post wrote coldly, "James Dean should learn to be a man before trying to be an idol." Paul was just as devastated. He was torn between 2 worlds. On one side, his fame career and home with Joanne Woodward. On the other, a love slowly dying in despair. He didn't know how to save James without dragging them both over the edge. In September of that year, James sent Paul one last message. Mexico City, Friday. If you don't come, I'll understand. Paul didn't go. At the time, he was in New York preparing for a photo shoot with Life magazine alongside Joanne. He had the plane ticket in hand, even made it to LaGuardia Airport, but he turned back out of fear, out of weakness, out of a lack of courage to destroy everything he had built. Then on September 30th, 1955, James Dean died in a car crash in Cholame, California. The news broke in CBS's 8 p.m. radio broadcast. Paul heard it from the radio in the living room of the Plaza Hotel. He didn't eat or sleep for 3 days. In a summer 2008 recording, Paul recalled, "I sat looking at my hands. They didn't shake, not a tear. Only one question kept repeating in my head. Why didn't I get on that plane? If I'd gone that day, would he still be alive?" From that moment, Paul Newman never spoke James Dean's name in front of anyone. But family members said that whenever he was drunk, he would look up at the ceiling and whisper, "I'm sorry, you should have lived a brilliant life." And until the final years of his life, Paul kept in the nightstand drawer a faded handkerchief, the only thing left from their last trip together to Oi. 5. Salo, a young love strangled by prejudice. At that time, Paul Newman was little more than a shattered man. Outwardly, he still carried himself with elegance. Still a symbol, still America's model husband in the public eye. But inside, he had collapsed. After Steve, he had been pushed deep into an abyss of self-loathing. The man who had once known how to love in silence had now become the reason he saw deceit, violation, and manipulation everywhere he looked. In September 1974, Paul sought out a psychologist in West Hollywood, discreetly recommended by Joanne, his wife, who had always chosen silence and forgiveness. He didn't say much, only murmured, "I'm so tired. I need somewhere I can breathe." And it was there on a rainy afternoon, as gray as ash, that Sal Mano walked in. By then, Sal had long stepped away from the bright lights. After Rebel Without a Cause, he had once been called the second James Dean, but because of his uncanny resemblance to James, he also shared the same tragedy cast aside by the Hollywood machine for being too sensitive, too fragile, too real, and because of the whispers about his sexuality. "You're in treatment, too?" Paul asked. Sal nodded, then tapped his temple lightly. "Not to cure an illness, but to cure what they made me believe was an illness." From then on, they began taking walks together after each therapy session. No hugs, no kisses, no one trying to seduce the other. Just two lonely men, both trying to breathe normally in a world burdened with abnormal pressures. Once S scribbled a note on a small piece of paper and quietly slipped it into Paul's jacket pocket. "If they call you a freak, then let me be a freak with you." Love came softly, like breath not rushed, and feverish like it had been with Steve, not fierce, and consuming like it was with Brando. Just that every morning, Paul would find a handwritten note left by his door, where S had written, "Did you sleep well? I often wonder if you woke up one morning and I was no longer here, would you come looking for me?" Paul once admitted S was the first person who made me feel I didn't have to hide who I was when I was with him. I forgot I was Paul Newman. They had planned to go to Venice together in the spring of 1976. There, S wanted to write a screenplay for the two of them to star in a story about two men who find each other in a city sinking under floodwaters. But that trip would never happen. On the night of February 12, 1976, S was stabbed to death just outside his apartment in West Hollywood as he was about to enter after rehearsing the play P.S. Your cat is dead. The killer was an unknown young man. Police initially called it a robbery, but Paul knew it was the fate of a man who dared to live truthfully. When he heard the news, Paul stayed silent for 3 days. He didn't speak to anyone, only sat on the roof, looking out over the city, and then in a recorded tape, his voice trembled. "I used to think I was the one healing him, but it was S who pulled me out of the abyss. He never needed anything from me except for me to dare to be myself, and I never got the chance to say thank you." 6. Montgomery Cliff. The last love and the pain that could not be named. I once believed nothing in this world could destroy me, until the day Joanne stood before me, her hands trembling, holding out the letter she had found under my pillow, a handwritten note from Monty, penned in blue ink, the slanted script bearing his full name. I had never seen eyes so utterly shattered. In 1966, while Paul was filming a Homer in Tucson, Arizona, Joanne Woodward suddenly flew to the set without warning. In her hand was an opened envelope. There was no accusation, no tears, only a cold single sentence. "So this is why you haven't slept for the past 2 years." After each of their encounters, Montgomery Cliff would send Paul secret letters. They were not filled with romantic endearments, but with tear-stained monologues. Once Monty wrote, "I don't need you to choose me, I only ask that you don't deny my existence." Joanne had read them all. Worse still, one of the letters was discovered by a wardrobe assistant and leaked into the hands of Clara Jenkins, a reporter for the National Enquirer. That November, the press erupted. Headlines screamed across front pages. Paul Newman and Monty Cliff, the buried truth. 20th Century Fox immediately sent Paul a formal demand for an explanation regarding extramarital relationships that may damage commercial image. Just 48 hours later, Joanne packed her belongings and left the house. She left behind a single-folded note containing only one line: "If you choose to live in lies, at least don't drag me down with you." Paul nearly lost his mind, not because the secret was out, but because he had failed to protect anyone. Not Joanne, not Monty, and certainly not himself. A few days later, Monty called from New York. His voice was weary, but resolute. "I'm sorry, but I can't take this anymore. I don't want to live like a shadow. I don't want to be your secret." Paul pleaded with Monty to fly to Los Angeles, promising to move out, to start over, even to go public if necessary. But Monty refused. Less than a month later, on the night of January 23, 1967, Paul received a phone call from Kevin McCarthy, Monty's close friend. The voice on the other end was choked. "Monty's in the hospital. He swallowed a handful of sleeping pills. They saved him, but he doesn't want to see anyone anymore, especially you." Paul collapsed entirely. In just 4 short weeks, he had lost his wife, lost his lover, been outed by the press, seen his contract for Cool Hand. Luke delayed for personal reasons and faced a lawsuit from Universal Studios for breach of moral image clause, demanding $1.2 million, a staggering sum for that time. He quietly admitted himself to a psychiatric recovery center in the Connecticut suburbs using a false name. His medical records listed the diagnosis severe anxiety disorder following emotional trauma, nervous exhaustion accompanied by a state of self-denial. No one ever knew because Paul paid both his legal and media teams to erase all traces. In the private diary of his psychiatrist, Dr. Richard Hale later leaked there was a single haunting line: "He doesn't want to live, but he doesn't dare to die. It is the most terrifying state I have ever witnessed." Monty didn't wait for him to recover. 9 years later, on a cold February night in 1976, Montgomery Cliff was found dead in his West Hollywood apartment from a heart attack following a phone call that ended in a scream. He was gone. And I just kept living trapped forever. In the moment, I didn't hold on to his hand. I thought I was strong. But in the end, I was only a coward who knew how to love. The tape stopped there. Not another word. And perhaps that was why it became the most haunting fragment of Paul Newman's memory. A man who had buried a doomed love for half a century, only daring to speak it aloud when his life was already measured in weeks. Paul Newman has passed away, taking with him reels of tapes that were never once made public. Inside them are names, romances, and wounds, all lying silently in the shadows of a Hollywood that appear dazzling on the surface, yet hid behind countless masks and layers of deceit. He once said, "I don't tell this story to be forgiven. I tell it so that I won't be forgotten." And now you are the one listening to those final confessions. But have you ever wondered how much of this story is the truth? And how much is merely the echo of a soul counting down its final breaths? Share your thoughts with us in the comments. Don't forget to like the video, share it with those who have loved and admired Paul Newman, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next installment.